rapidly taking its place among the first Big Ten of songdom, and which was first introduced
Here we
by
go,
Benny
then.
Goodman and his orchestra. Lost with Benny Goodman and Helen Ward.
Welcome along, everybody. Let's see if the chat thing is working tonight. There it is. Hey, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Hey, Martin. Brand new presentation tonight. Hey, Gene. Hey, Luann. Hey, Denise. Hey, Karen. Hey, Mary. Hey, Luann. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Bridget and Mary Jo. Hey, Evelyn. Welcome, everybody. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Mary. Hey, Christy in Atlanta. Hey, Larry. See you next month, Christy. Hey, Carolyn. Hey, Audrey. Hey, Mom, that was quick. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Doreen. Hey, Gary. Oh, I'm on a big TV, huh? Hey, Don. Hey, Jerry. Welcome, everybody. Hey, Susan. Hey, yeah, you can see Priya is back there on the green chair. Sitting right there. Miles is on this other green chair right here. Yeah. Hey, Caesar and Carolina in Poland. All right, people from all over. Hey, Timothy. Hey, Marie. Hey, Emily. Thank you, Christy. They are beautiful. Hey, Kathleen and Carol in Ocala, Florida. Tonight I am drinking Blackened, the only whiskey aged by blasting Metallica into the cask. This is a special edition made in black brandy casks. And the marketing copy on it, talking about how it's something to drink with no remorse and feel no whiplash, etc., was just the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard on a whiskey that is already completely ridiculous. I had to buy a copy immediately. Or a bottle immediately. Well, that bodes well for tonight. Welcome along, everybody. This the black brandy cask version is kind of upfront notes of apricot jam. Yeah, it is actually a pretty good whiskey. But yeah, apricot jam. It's very tasty. It's a very sweet, kind of fruity whiskey. Blackberry or blackberry jam is kind of up front on the nose there. Welcome, everybody.
So you met someone who set you back on your heels. Goody goody. So you met
Hey, Laura.
now you know how it
Eden Timberley.
goody goody. So you gave
Hey,
me
April.
your heart too, just as I gave mine to you. And she broke it in little pieces. Now how do you do? So you lie awake just singing the blues all night. Goody goody. So you think that love's a barrel of dynamite. Hooray and
Hey, Karen. Hey, Susan.
you had it coming to ya. Goody goody for her. Goody goody for me. And I hope you're satisfied you ran to you.
I liked I used to get blackberry Mocha David wine and marinate chicken in it in college. That was pretty good. So yeah, blackberry as a flavor tasting note in whiskey is not common. But this is pretty tasty. Blackened is the ale. Winter it will sail. Big, and hangman's blood is also said to cure what ails you. According to Elizabeth Munn, the vampire of St. Louis, who was actually thwarted by Abraham Lincoln once when he commuted a sentence. That's a whole other story. Hey, Wendy. Hey, Gregory. Hey, Dana.
How do you like a combination like this? Benny Goodman and his swing music and Hoagie Carmichael's Immortal Stardust. Listen up.
Hey, Elmira. And Karen and Debbie and Ellen. Hey, everybody. Hey, Amy, Liz. Missed a couple people there. Hey, Gene. Evening, Amy. Welcome all around, one and all. Hey, Avi. Evening, everybody. Welcome along. Hey, Lisa and Susan. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Diane. Hey, Octavio. Hey, Kristen. Fatty. Yeah, Octavio, that's a little too soon. We can all sing Hing Hang Hung, I guess. Oh, Avi, that's awesome. And evening to you, Johan. I found at least one major thing about you today. I found Marie, his last victim's divorce file from her previous husband. Looked through that at the legal archives today, and there was one big surprise in there. Maybe I'll put it on the Patreon on Friday. Hey, Paula. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Christy. Hey, Linda. We all getting excited about Mysterious Chicago Dinner Series? We're still working on that, but I know that the chef is this evening testing a recipe. Yes, Johan, though I think you were guilty, I tend to agree. All questions about capital punishment aside, any case in which Shippey and Hoffman were involved probably should have been commuted just on general principles. That inspector and that particular coroner, nothing they said was reliable. Snow coming in Iowa, all right. Rich is snoring, well, that's par for the course. Hey, Alice. Now wake up, Dad. Hey, Dina. Hey, John.
Benny Goodman and his orchestra are holding...
Right, and that sounds right.
...urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. Let's dance on with Sandman.
Hey, Geraldine. Marie, we're working on a series of historical dinners. There'll be dinners or cocktail parties of that nature in which we recreate a historical location. I got a chef coming up with menus historically inspired, if not historically accurate. Most of these places you don't really want to eat what they were actually having. Well, we're also got to find venues, etc., and work out all of the details. Octavio, that's a bummer. I don't know if there are still tickets for me next week in the Room 13 Speakeasy series. Yes, Susan, we discussed Meatloaf being historical on Whiskey and a Cookie a while back. Seems to have become a part of American vernacular around the 30s or 40s. And of course, its big break in the late 70s. You remember we were at that cemetery in Lafayette the day that Meatloaf died, and I actually saw a bat flying overhead. Which was probably not a bat, it was Meatloaf's heart still beating, ripping out of his body and flying away. Like a bat out of hell! I sold out in 4 hours. Sweet! Let's not mention Rocky Horror too much. I'm only just starting to get it kind of out of my head, having seen it again lately. Yeah, Audrey, several months ago. Didn't get vaccinated. Found out, you know. Sell out with me tonight. Sell out with me, oh Miles. Miles gotta get his nails trimmed soon, because he's scratching me up all day long, yeah. Alright, we're gonna let Benny do a little bit, do like one more bit of a tune here, because I got distracted. But it's about time to get going. Miles, I feel like, is gonna make this first portion of the tour difficult today. Hey, Tom and Amarillo. Sweet Amarillo, in the willow. Lynn, yes, and come on, when I'm hanging around out with naval secrets secreted in my belly button, I'm a little more discreet than that guy. I thought I responded to it. Sorry if I didn't get it. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Georgia. Hey, Eileen. Hey, Aviva. Oh, yeah. Rocky Horror showing at Mystericon. That would be fun. It would be really obscene. Hey, Jackie. Glad to have you. Hey, Tracy. Hello, everybody. Miles is just kind of hanging out here for a second. Aren't you, Miles? Purr, purr, purr. We're about to talk about terrible things. Hey, Kimberly. Yeah, Sarah is in Des Moines. Came out to my speech in Des Moines, in Johnston, Iowa. Almost 2 years ago now. Well, not quite that much, I guess. The mayor of Johnston had me out to give a speech about the naked Trike-Angel statue, of which I am an expert. One of my little niche expertise areas. We'll let Helen sing this tune. Miles is over here purring and purring and purring. Oh, the oddities market. I'm usually at the oddities market. Yeah, Adrian, I am just your, I am just your target audience. Karen, happy septuplastiversary. I can't give you anything. Miles. You're gonna make this tour difficult for me, aren't you? Well, everybody, we're gonna start in just a second here. Letting Benny Goodman finish up this tune, then we'll start properly. Also, maybe then Miles will start behaving. There you go. Just have a seat there, Miles. That's a good boy. Just relax. Just relax. Evening, Linda. Evening, everybody. Hey, Nancy. Welcome along, everybody. I got Miles, with your tail in the way like that, it gets a little difficult. So we're going to move over to this. Slightly different angle for me. Yeah, Adrian, by all means, post a little bit on the oddities market there. I am usually at the oddities market. I never set up there, but I'm usually a customer.
We are swinging along to the music.
And I was an Atlas Obscura field agent for a long time.
Urban Room of the Congress Hotel, Chicago. And listen
All right, so that is Benny Goodman live in the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. And from there, ladies and gentlemen, it is time that we get started properly. So welcome along, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, so I am incredibly famous. People I love are telling me not to say that anymore, but it's part of the act. Among my books, Mysterious Chicago, the books, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, New from Thames and Hudson, and Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets from University of Illinois Press. One thing not mentioned here is I also did one years ago under a different name called Fatal Drop, which was all about tales of hangings in Chicago. So over the course of my career, I have investigated just about every hanging story and read just about every account of these things. This comes up in other stuff too. Often I'll be doing talking head work for some H.H. Holmes show, and they'll want me to really make a big deal out of the fact that when Holmes was hanged, it took about 15 minutes for his heart to stop. In Devil in the White City, I guess they make it look like that was almost supernatural. Well, go read any other account of a 19th century hanging. It'll say, there's a pretty good chance it's going to say the same thing. Almost every time, in fact. But what we're going to talk about today is some hangings in Chicago. This is one, I couldn't find a good title for this tour. I'm just calling it Was the Wrong Man Hanged? But I would estimate there were roughly 100 judicial hangings in Chicago between 1840 and 1927 when they switched to the electric chair. Currently, we do not execute anymore because the system was just too broken. That was what they cited, was there's been too many cases where DNA evidence later exonerated somebody. These will go back before that, but I would estimate that out of those 100 or so, at least half were probably convicted on really shaky evidence. I don't want to fathom a guess on how many people were actually innocent, but I'm sure that it was more than one. There's also a lot of people, times where they were really inconsistent about sentencing and so on and so on. But to start with, we're going to go back to Springfield a little bit. This is a story I just came across. This is Abraham Lincoln's backyard. I realized the only film footage I really have of the Lincoln house is his outhouse. It was a 3-holer. But there you go. He wasn't always using his friends' hats. But Abraham Lincoln, in 1841, down in Springfield, there was a very strange murder case that Lincoln was involved in and actually wrote about. He wrote like a true crime story about this, and I love it when I find out the people that I researched did some of my same job. Like when I found out that Lillian Colley, of the Wind Blew In, wrote some true crime stuff herself, that just blew me away. But in 1841, there was a case where a guy by the name of Archibald Fisher was living in a boarding house in Springfield. He wasn't quite right in the head, as they would say. Recently, he had had some kind of accident with a gun going off a little too close to his head. Mind had never been quite right since. But then one day, he disappeared from the boarding house. And after a few days, people got suspicious and also noted that a couple of the Traylor brothers were spending like a sailor. Did our boys do something rash? One of the Traylor brothers eventually confessed, yes, they had murdered Archibald Fisher and dropped the body off in a creek. So the way Lincoln put it was this: examinations were made of all cellars, wells, and pits of all descriptions where it thought possible the body might be concealed. All the fresh, or tolerably fresh, graves at the graveyard were pried into, and dead horses were disinterred. They looked and looked, didn't find the body, but after all, they had a confession. The Traylor brothers were put on trial for murder. Lincoln was on the team that defended them in court. After the prosecution made their case, saying, hey, we've got a conviction, and we've got these stories about the Traylor brothers spending money, all these gold coins, obviously they did it, right? This should be an easy case. But Lincoln's team just brought out one witness, a doctor who said, Mr. Fisher is at my house. He has not been murdered. He's not in very good shape. He had a bit of a blackout and wandered off. He's currently at my house in Peoria. And that was enough. The case was dismissed. A couple of days later, Archibald Fisher appeared back in town, alive and well, despite the confession that these guys had killed him and dumped the body in a creek. Now, Lincoln himself ended up writing a whole pamphlet about this called A Strange Affair. He wrote about it twice. Well, it's a pamphlet here. It was a newspaper article for a Quincy, Illinois newspaper in 1846. This is a pamphlet about it published years later. Now, in 1841, the day after it happened, he wrote a letter to Joshua Speed and said, well, it would have been a lot more dramatic if we'd actually had him walk into the courtroom himself, but we can't have everything. But he also noted at the end, Hart, the little drayman that hauled Mary Todd home once, said it was too damn bad to have so much trouble and no hanging. He also noted that if it hadn't been for that doctor, it was a sure bet that the Traylor brothers would have been convicted and probably hanged. Now, this has been brought up occasionally as evidence that a confession isn't really foolproof. And this is something we've only gradually come to figure out in legal circles, really, that just because somebody confesses to murder doesn't mean it was actually true. It's always been considered like a gold standard. And you might be wondering, like everybody did at the time, why would somebody confess to murder if they hadn't done it? Well, there was recently a study of 350 convictions that were known to have been wrongful convictions in capital cases between 1900 and 1985. Of those, 49% used false confessions. And, there are various conditions that lead to it, but a few things that they see over and over is people are more likely to make a false confession if they have been held or interrogated for a really long time. They were more likely to make a false confession if the police are lying and saying, we've got evidence to convict you already, so you might as well just confess. Or 3, if they're members of a vulnerable group, children, people who don't speak the language, minority religions and races, the developmentally disabled, etc. And we see that all of those things happen in a lot of the cases we're going to cover. So we're going to do just some basics of the Chicago gallows here. There were a few public executions in Chicago. There was one on the South Side Dunes and 2 on what is now Ashland between Taylor and Polk. But in the 1850s, things were moved. They were moved to the jail. They were public executions were outlawed. A few happened in the jail that was in the Loop, but then starting in the 1870s, they were here at the courthouse that still stands. Well, not the courthouse itself. There was a jail at the time back behind the place. The jail looked about like this. And in it, whenever there was a hanging, they would set up the gallows right around right around the north corridor, most of the time. It seems to have been set up in different places at different times. But this is what the Chicago gallows looked like. Notice in the back there's this little thing that looks like a door. That's actually a little compartment where everybody was told, at least, that the actual hangman was standing. He was hidden, concealed from view. They would call him Monsieur de Chicago when they were joking around in the press room. Nobody knew who the hangman was, but the story was that when it was time to drop the trap door, the sheriff would give a sort of a signal and the hangman would drop it. About 10 years after hangings in Chicago stopped, the old coroner's physician said there was never anybody in that thing. It was always the sheriff doing everything. That was just kind of a ruse to take the heat off of the sheriff. Which, it was possible that it had been like that the entire time. Possibly there was a guy in there at one point. But we consistently see in drawings and references to the hangings in Chicago, we consistently see that going back to at least the 1880s. Here's another view of it. You can see it in the back. This is from the Chicago Chronicle. And what they're doing in this drawing is hanging bags of sand. That was something that they would do the night before. You can see like the tiers of the prison cells over on the side there. They would do this to get the spring out of the rope. And newspapers liked writing about this stuff. By the turn of the 20th century, the days when they had like 2 pages above and below the fold about every hanging were kind of over. But now and then, like the Chicago Chronicle in the 1890s still loved covering hangings. And this goes back quite a while in Chicago. In fact, the Chicago Times had a very famous headline, "Jerked to Jesus," which was not even about a Chicago hanging. There's also, one of the reasons these were people would defend this, even though they knew that not everybody getting hanged was probably actually guilty. People would defend this by saying that we have to create a sense of law and order. We have to make people feel that justice will be served. We have to make people trust things, because otherwise they're just going to resort to lynch law. This wasn't strictly a Southern thing or even strictly a racial thing. This morning we talked about a hanging that took place in Duluth, Minnesota back in the early 20s. In 1889, there was one in Topeka where it was a white man who was lynched by crowds numbering in the thousands. But a lot of people in the legal profession and the law enforcement profession believed that having as many hangings as you could, judicially, was the only way to keep this sort of thing from happening. But that also led to people being, the police department and the state's attorneys were always very focused on just getting convictions. Sometimes they would pin it on the person they thought they were most likely to convict, not the person who most likely did it. Famous example of that we've covered here a few times is the Herman Billick case. This is the grave of the Vrazel family at Bohemian National Cemetery. The early 20th century, the Vrazel family started dying off. Now, the police landed on a guy by the name of Herman Billick, the family fortune teller who had been in their employ. Their idea was that perhaps he had given them all arsenic because he was having an affair with Mrs. Vrazel and wanted to kill everybody else off so he could inherit the family farm and all of their money. Now, evidence against this was really fairly slight. In fact, there's probably more evidence now that Emma Vrazel, a daughter of the family, was the one who was really doing it. But police knew that it was going to be really hard to convict her. Women never seemed to get convicted of murder in Chicago. Eventually, a few of them did, but none of them ever were executed in Chicago. Billick, however, was a fortune teller with an accent that would have been unusual to people. That was the kind of guy they absolutely could convict. So while Billick was in prison, another member of the family died. He couldn't have poisoned them himself. So the coroner, Peter Hoffman, absolutely rushed through as fast as he could. Didn't really do an investigation at all. Didn't really test for arsenic. Just said, nope, natural causes, that's it. Because it would have damaged his case. Now, mostly Billick was convicted based on the testimony of Jerry Vrazel, a son of the family who was just a teenager at the time. But then after Vrazel was convicted and sentenced to be hanged, he went to a lawyer and said, none of that stuff that I said was true. They told me I had to say that I had seen Mr. Billick giving my family powders. They said that they had evidence against me, and if I didn't say that, they were going to hang me. This is a really dirty trick, but it's exactly the kind of thing that they would have done in those days. Billick was eventually pardoned. Here's him after he got out of jail. This has all been covered in a little more detail in a book on Billick called Poisoned by Steve Shookus. I'll leave that up here for just a second. It goes into the case in great detail and makes a very good case that Emma Vrazel almost had to be the actual killer. It almost couldn't have been Billick. If it had been, they absolutely framed a guilty man. I noticed this a lot, like reading up on the Johann Hawk case. I'm not saying Johann Hawk was innocent, but they did frame him. Sometimes that happens. Now, in any case, the team that was in charge of this case, we had Coroner Hoffman, who would later be sheriff and later spend time in his own jail for being so fabulously corrupt. This was a guy who, as coroner, there are numerous cases where his office would rule that somebody had died of tuberculosis after molten lead would pour on him at a factory. Clearly, they were on the payroll of the factory owners for that one. There was also Inspector George Shippey, who was known for doing all kinds of underhanded tactics, all kinds of leading the witnesses, all kinds of intimidating the witnesses. He was the kind of guy that there was a murder and he would rent the horse that was involved in the murder to see if the horse would magically lead him to the killers. Touch unbalanced himself, eventually ended up in an asylum. These guys were involved in so many cases that I've covered and were so fabulously corrupt and strange that I honestly think almost any case they were involved in should be given a commuted sentence just on general principles. But we'll go back to before them. They'll only really cover the last cases or so in this particular presentation. So we're going to start here in Wicker Park, near Black Hawk and Bosworth. Back in February of 1881, a woman who lived on Black Hawk looked through her window in the middle of the night and saw a couple of guys trying to break into a nearby house. One of them was wearing a Scotch cap. There were no streetlights at the time. She only saw them by the moonlight. But having seen them, she saw that they were about to break into a house. But then the owner of the house looked out the window, saw them, and started shooting. The two of them shot back, then ran off into the alley, as seen here. I don't know how many of these buildings are original, but the alley's still here. We'll zip ahead a bit, so we'll rush down the alley like they did. This great Sweet Home Chicago garage. Eventually, they found a partition between the houses and made their way down here to Bosworth Street. Now, the only witness here only saw these guys lighted by the moon and wearing hats. But in the process of fleeing, one of them ended up fatally shooting a police officer. about the police just went around and arrested all of the usual suspects for a while. They arrested at least a dozen known thieves and pickpockets before landing on a guy by the name of James Tracy. Tracy, I think, was the 13th guy that they had arrested. He was a well-educated Civil War veteran, but had been wandering the country making a living more or less as a robber. He was brought in and identified, then allegedly, while in prison, told one of his cellmates, well, I had to shoot the guy or else I was going to get the collar, get captured. So he was eventually brought to trial, and after he was convicted and sentenced to die, he told a newspaper reporter, that confession thing, do I look like an idiot to you? Ended up writing a rather interesting thing. He noted that he was pretty sure he was going to get convicted just because his attorney wasn't all that good. He said, if a man can only lift 100 pounds, I can't expect him to lift 200. Shortly before his execution, he wrote a very convincing letter saying that there's no way that this woman possibly could have recognized him through warped glass in the middle of the night without any light with a hat on. He wrote a very well-written thing talking about, I feel the shadow of the gallows resting on my head. I may not profess any affected sentiment of remorse or hopes for forgiveness, but I am not going to death with the desperate resolution which usually characterizes the common murderer. I feel my situation keenly. I dread the disgrace and ignominy of the gallows, the idea, not the fear to die. Well, here's where it gets kind of weird. Tracy was hanged in 1882. A team of doctors then took him to the nearest office and started pumping him full of electricity to see if they could bring him back to life. And he'd been told that this was going to happen. One reason it was suggested that he ended up going to the gallows bravely, despite the fact that he was really, really adamant about his innocence, is that he thought he was going to be up and walking around again. And his neck had been broken in the fall, so they weren't going to get him up and walking around again. But the doctor, Walter Haynes, said years later, yeah, we got color in his cheeks, we got his expression to move around, we got his heart beating again. This is a retelling of it from about 30 years later in a Sunday pullout magazine from the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean. No matter how reputable your paper, the Sunday pullouts in those days were always like the Weekly World News. But he doesn't really say anything in the interview here that doesn't match up with what was published at the time back in 1882. Haynes also would later be involved in the Johann Hawk case. And Tracy is the first guy we're going to cover who is now in Section H up here at Calvary Cemetery. Just over the line into Evanston. And we'll move ahead about 3 years. Here. Start a little bit here on Madison Street. One day in 1885, a trunk dealer up in this area, right around these buildings, it was a little bit further east than this, but sold a trunk to a few people. A few weeks later, that trunk arrived in Pittsburgh containing the dead body of a guy by the name of Felipe Caruso. Now, it was traced back to Chicago and eventually traced back to some guys who lived on Tilden Street, which a section of Tilden Street on the west side that no longer exists. It's where the interstate is now to the left over here. But they would have been kind of by the Target on Jackson and Racine. So eventually 3 people were brought in and arrested, held for several days before confessing. A guy by the name of Giraldi, a guy by the name of Silvestri, and a guy by the name of Azari. The story was that they lured Caruso into the house here on Tilden Street to be shaved. It was said that it was the custom in those days that these guys would shave each other. But they knew that this fruit peddler, Caruso, had saved up $145 by peddling fruit over the years and had it sewn into his pants at all times. So the story was that they had strangled him, taken the money, then mailed the body in a trunk to Pittsburgh. Now, they got confessions out of these guys in jail, but how in the world they got confessions is kind of anybody's guess. They spoke a thick Sicilian dialect. Nobody on the police force could actually translate it. There was only one Italian man on the force at all at the time, and he didn't work on this case. One newspaper, the only newspaper that really mentioned this, said that they had a guy working as an interpreter that they called Dago Joe. This does not exactly inspire me with confidence that the police were being entirely accurate here. Witnesses all gave very vague statements. One said that they had seen him with the trunk, but it was at a time when she would have been in school. The trunk dealer said he had sold these men the trunk, but then he said that all Italians looked alike to him, so he wasn't a very good witness. And anyway, the murder appeared to have happened on May 1st, which was moving day. It was the day that leases ended, and by some estimates, about 50% of the people in the neighborhood would have been hauling trunks around. Two of them were defended in court by Kate Kane Rossi, one of the only women operating as a lawyer in Chicago at the time. Another was represented by Maurice Bauman, one of very few black lawyers operating in the city at the time. Really not a lot is known about Maurice Bauman. Kate Kane Rossi we have quite a lot more data about. She's a whole story in and of herself. By no means did these guys get a fair trial, but they were convicted. Here's another diagram of the gallows that was built for them. And this one, too, has been covered in a lot of great detail. The Chicago trunk murder by Elizabeth Dale came out a few years back. And what she analyzed, she doesn't really make a very convincing case that these guys were innocent. The most important thing is she did make the case that these guys absolutely did not get a fair trial or a fair conviction. Now, whether they did or not is something else, but there's strong reason to believe they did not. For one thing, with the story that they had strangled him doesn't match up with the condition of the body one bit. But they were all hanged. I'm trying to avoid particularly graphic shots here. And they, too, are now in Section H here at Calvary Cemetery. Now, that was a 3-person hanging, which was new at the time, but of course, a year or so later, there were even more of them after the Haymarket affair. Now, this would be a whole tour in and of itself, but in the 1880s, there was a rally for the 8-hour workday. Soon as the permit expired, the cops started marching towards it, pointing guns at everybody, and at some point, a bomb went off. I always liked this particular painting. The guy looked, oh, look at the time. I better be getting out of here. Nobody knew who threw the bomb. They didn't make that much of an effort to find who threw the bomb. They just arrested all the people associated with the speakers at the rally, and 5 of them, including a couple of guys who weren't even there, were eventually sentenced to be hanged. And 4 of them were. A 5th, a guy by the name of Louis Ling, bit into a dynamite cap and blew his own head off. They would eventually be posthumously pardoned by Governor Altgeld based on the fact that the evidence utterly failed to convict these guys. It was just one of those cases where they were kind of afraid that if they didn't hang these guys, the world would not be safe for democracy. But now there's a whole monument to these guys out at Forest Home Cemetery. Now Haymarket would be a whole tour in and of itself. And we'll cut some of the gruesome stories for a second to talk a little bit about Judge Goggin. I enjoy Judge Goggin. This is a case where he ordered Chief Badenoch, the guy who was the chief of police during the H.H. Holmes investigation, to pay all the court costs after really just raking them through the coals for the practice they had of sending boys to the Bridewell, the jail, as much as they possibly could. They were constantly arresting kids without a warrant and sending them to the Bridewell for vagrancy or for suspected pickpocketing or for just kind of looking like they were up to no good. And he specifically said, this thing of filling up the Bridewells with young boys has got to be stopped, and this is the only way to do it. If you catch these boys in the act, send them to Pontiac, but it does no good to arrest them on suspicion. You can never get a conviction. So Judge Goggin is also a case in about 1900. A guy was robbed in the Levee District, and he said, well, what did you think was going to happen? This old steamboat was paddling along full of whiskey. The only regret I have is that you didn't have more money for them to steal. Interesting guy. There's also a case, 1892, he got a woman out of the Bridewell when she said that she had been arrested in order to pay a fine, but then taken to the Bridewell, the jail, before she had a chance to actually pay the fine, even though she could. This kind of thing happened all the time. 1896, he wrote a book that has never seemed to be published. They published some excerpts in the newspapers, but it is from him that we have a couple of the anecdotes about the next cases. One of them that he was specifically mad about was a guy named Buff Higgins. Now, I don't have video of the exact space where this one went down. It would have been just a couple of blocks south of here, at like Roosevelt and Halstead, that general vicinity. This is Taylor and Halstead, pretty close. Everything from here to there is just University of Illinois at Chicago stuff, so same stuff as you'd see here. Back then it would have been residences. September of 1893, a guy named Peter McCooey was asleep in a bed around here when a noise woke him up. He stumbled out of bed and shot at a burglar. 3 men were present at the time. They all ran away. In the process, Peter McCooey himself was shot and killed. Buff Higgins nearby was found, a young man named Buff Higgins was found under a sidewalk hiding out nearby. The papers brought him in for what was called a severe cross-examination. He denied that he had done anything. After a severe cross-examination, they took him to the house where the dead man was, made him look at the corpse and said, "Look at your work." Then, according to Judge Goggin, they stripped him naked and put him in a jail cell for the next 5 days. After that, they brought him out, not having given him any food in the entire time, gave him an entire pint of whiskey to drink, then put a piece of paper in front of him saying, "Here's your alibi statement. Just sign this and you'll be free to go." Now, he was completely drunk and in no fit state to sign a document at that point, plus he couldn't read, so he didn't know that what he was signing was really a confession. And he was hanged on the basis of that confession. At the time when he was hanged, the prisoners were shouting, "Hang the governor," instead. He, too, is in Section H at Calvary Cemetery. Now, this is a good question. How do you hide under a sidewalk? At the time, the sidewalks were kind of elevated up above the ground, just up above the mud. They all would have been made out of wood. Goggin also covered a guy by the name of Butch Lyons. In 1895, he was accused of shooting a man to death. Now, this had been a drunken fight. He was walking through what would now be the West Loop over by where the Chicago Fire Training Academy is, where the Great Chicago Fire started. Was walking around and got into a fight with another guy. The other guy pulled a gun. Lyons grabbed the gun. The gun went off, and the guy was grazed in the forehead, but not so badly hurt that he wasn't able to continue drinking for the rest of the night. This guy even said after Lyons was arrested, "Lyons isn't so bad. He didn't hurt me any." But not enough witnesses heard him say that, and a couple of days later he died. Witnesses who had heard it were not called at the trial. Lyons was only in his early 20s, but he had already been arrested by some accounts 100 or 200 times, usually on things like vagrancy. The Chicago Chronicle said that he was reared in a rookery of crime. Now, the night before the hanging, he was sitting on what they called the death watch when he heard somebody shouting, "Hear all about it, all about the hanging, extra, extra." And he started laughing and said, "Why, that's Kid McLafferty. He was always fresh. I'm not in the air yet." Love that. He recognized the sound of a particular newsboy. But he was hanged the next day, despite grave doubts as to his own guilt, and also buried in Section H at Calvary Cemetery. Here's the thing, 11 months later, a guy was put in jail for debt. You could still go to debtor's prison back then. But ended up paying everything off the next day because while he was in jail, he heard the sound of ghosts. Now, he was hearing all these strange noises at night, and a guard said, "Why, hush, that is the ghost of Butch Lyons. The rope broke and he died in agony, and he has haunted the jail ever since." This was only 11 months after Butch Lyons was hanged, and contemporary accounts of him being hanged do not say anything about the rope breaking or him dying in agony. By all accounts, it was a very orderly hanging. He was probably thinking of another guy who'd been hanged a couple of years before by the name of George Painter. Looked like this and lived on South Green Street. We've covered him a little bit. The various tours before. So, May of 1891, George Painter started running around this neighborhood shouting, "Where is everybody? Help, help, are all you people dead? Someone has murdered my Alice." Now, inside of that house on Green Street was his girlfriend, Alice Martin. They were living together but not married, which was fairly unusual at the time, but she was lying in bed, beaten and pounded beyond all recognition. Now, Painter was arrested because they had no other suspects for this, but a lot of people noticed there were holes in the story. He'd been running around reporting the murder himself and wearing a suit of clothes that had no bloodstains on it. They didn't find a suit of clothes with any bloodstains on it. The two had been together for a few years but weren't married. Both seemed to have had affairs at various times. Painter was brought in for the murder. There was nothing but circumstantial evidence. There was even a couple of stories that a guy had walked into the Clinton House Hotel a couple hours later, saying covered in blood and saying he just trimmed a woman on Green Street. But eventually he was hanged. And on the scaffold, he made a whole big speech saying, "If I am guilty, then let me go to hell. Please let me go to hell if I am guilty." At one point, while he was in jail, he even offered to be hypnotized. The story going around at the time was if you hypnotize somebody, they have to tell the truth. So he said, then hypnotize me and ask me about the murder, and you'll know that I'm telling the truth. So he was eventually hanged, and in that case, the rope did break. Painter landed on his head. They were pretty sure he was already dead from the fall, but the sentence said he must hang by the neck until he was dead, so they hauled the rather heavy body up the steps and slid him back down the trap door again just for appearance's sake. A particularly gruesome case. But about 20 years later, the police got a letter saying, by the way, this tramp by the name of Jack Cadd, that was the person who killed Alice Martin. It wasn't George Martin. You hanged the wrong guy. Even before this letter came in, it was widely believed. I got plenty of letters on file in other people's clemency files. Whenever they're trying to convince somebody not to hang somebody in Chicago, they would point to George Painter as an example of a guy who had been wrongfully hanged. Whether he was even the best example they could have picked, that I don't really know. So we'll jump ahead about just another few years here. Talk about a guy that we covered just a week or so back. This is a coffee shop on Armitage Avenue. But it used to be a streetcar barn, the place where they stashed train cars and streetcars overnight. You can actually see these 4 garages here. They've all been redone and modernized now. But there was a period of time in the late 1890s when a lot of train robbers had figured out, hey, it's one thing to rob a train. It's easier if you just let them park first and then go rob the barn where they're storing it. So, one grim night in June 1895, a guy by the name of Casey Carey Birch, was murdered here in the car barn. He was a guy who was working on getting the money into the safe for the night. But at least one robber broke in, ended up shooting him in the process. Initially, it was reported it was just one robber, and they arrested initially a guy by the name of Manow. Now, after a bit of a manhunt, Julius Manow was brought in, along with a guy by the name of Joseph Windrath. Now, these are about the first ones in this case that we actually have photographs of. If guys before 1894, it's a little more unusual to have a photo. Now, Manow initially pleaded guilty, but then said afterwards, I only pleaded guilty because they told me if I did that, I'd get life in prison instead of the gallows. He ended up getting the gallows anyway and was awfully bitter about this. Meanwhile, Windrath appeared to be completely insane. They brought in a whole bunch of what they called alienists, psychologists, who said that he had to be faking it because he appeared to be suffering from both melancholia and dementia, and everybody knew you couldn't have 2 mental disorders at once. The kind of junk science that was going around at the time. Now, Windrath was hanged first. Manow got a couple of other reprieves after that. And the night before his execution, Manow wrote a letter saying, it's true, I accept full responsibility. I absolutely did murder Carey Birch. But Windrath wasn't even with me that night. You have hanged an innocent man. Now, this was widely seen as just something to make the judge look bad. There had been grave doubts as to whether Joseph Windrath, I think, had actually been involved in this, but a lot of people just thought that Manow was trying to make Judge Horton look bad. He had said, I was buncoed into this plea of guilty as the greenest Granger ever was conned with a shell game. I had no more show than a fly who gets into a spider's web. Horton was the spider. When this story got out that he was saying that Windrath hadn't even been there that night, Judge Horton immediately said, well, who are you going to believe? Me or a confessed murderer? On the scaffold the next day, Manow said, well, better a confessed murderer than an unconfessed one, like Judge Horton. The guy definitely had a good way with words with this stuff. And he too, Windrath anyway, also Section H. We'll jump into the 20th century here. This is a little section of street on Belden Avenue near Halstead. Belden and Burling. This was the site where Bessie Hollister was found dead in early 1906. Do a wide angle there. This is how the intersection looked at the time. One of these streets across the way on Belden here was a barn. Trying to match this up as well as we can. Looks like one building, it might still be original there, but it's hard to tell for sure. So you got Lincoln Avenue going in a diagonal, which kind of makes this one look a little skewed. But inside of the barn in early 1906, a young man by the name of Ivins stepped inside and then ran back to his own house on Halstead Street, just around the corner. And his house is still standing on Halstead, just below Fullerton. Check out his house here briefly. This big brick one. Ran back into this place and said, "There's a dead woman in the barn. Dad, go to the police." So he was too freaked out by what he had seen to do anything about it himself. He sent his dad to the police. The fact that he had sent his dad made the police themselves suspicious that maybe it was him. So they brought him in for questioned him for quite a long time, and immediately announced that he was the murderer. So I want to quick point out that this was a case involving, over on the left there's Inspector Shippey, over on the right is Coroner Hoffman. And the case was brought to trial by Harry Olson, the assistant state's attorney, who was a strong believer in the death penalty as a means of deterring hangings. He had actually been present in 1889, the hanging in Topeka, the lynching. So Richard Ivins made a confession in jail that he in fact had been the killer himself. Then several months later, while he was awaiting execution, a criminologist by the name of J. Sanderson Christensen put out a pamphlet called The Tragedy of Chicago, A Study in Hypnotism, How an Innocent Young Man Was Hypnotized to the Gallows. Now, his idea here, the case that he puts forth, and he includes all of the confessions, a lot of the cross-examinations, and a lot of interesting stuff in here, was that Ivins was completely innocent. The police had just been so desperate for a conviction that they hypnotized him. Now, there's a lot of stuff that Christensen says that puts him in the realm of New Age gobbledygook. He also has things like he didn't have a degenerate type ear and all that kind of phrenology garbage that's nuts now. And also his caption of this picture, a photograph taken at the police station by the Chicago Tribune photographer a few hours after the arrest. It shows the hypnotic expression of his face and passive attitude. This is not exactly evidence that a person was hypnotized. But in going through all of the statements, he does identify lots and lots of holes in the confession. Now, he uses the term hypnotism. When you really read through it, it sounds more like what we would now call gaslighting. This was just a lot of leading questions, a lot of threats, and a lot of kind of messing with his mind. There's a lot of things in the confession that don't really make sense. During the time that he said that it happened, in fact, he had over a dozen alibis stating that he was home the whole time. Also, the thing involved him jumping over a 6-foot-tall fence. It involved her doing a lot of screaming at a time when several neighbors would have been able to hear it. It involves him killing her the night before at a time when she clearly would have been killed in the morning based on the breakfast food that was still in her stomach at the time. Now, unfortunately, putting the whole hypnosis business on this makes it difficult to take seriously, but there's a lot of problems with the confession. A lot of problems with the stuff. And again, false confessions, when you've been interrogated for a long time, are not that uncommon. He didn't actually write the confessions himself, he just signed them. Now, there was a case right around the same time period. A guy by the name of Jocko Briggs was convicted of murdering a tobacconist here at Damon and Lake in a tobacco shop. Now, he was convicted to be hanged as well, but Evelyn Campbell, the reporter from the Chicago American who had helped to apprehend Johann Hawk, literally got involved in that case, believed that Jocko was innocent and worked so hard on a case that eventually she was able to prove that it was true. This is a couple of excerpts of his diary were later published. He was eventually given a pardon after being convicted and sentenced to hang. This was occasionally known to happen. Also covered just quickly. There's an interesting thing on Taylor Street. There used to be a street right here on the right, just before you get to Ashland heading west. And what is now really the alley behind that runs alongside a convenience store used to be Sibley Street. This is kind of the relic of Sibley Street right here. Now, at Sibley Street in 1920, there was a guy named Antonio Lopez living. He and his buddies went to a grocery store for cigars. They might have all gone at once, might not have. There's a lot of conflicting opinions. But one of his buddies, eventually, after complaining about the bread at the bakery, pulled out a gun and said, "Hands up." After that, he shot a couple of tomato cans. Cans of tomatoes. Then a guy came running out from the back room and ended up being shot to death. Eventually, 3 of the guys present were arrested and sentenced to be hanged, including Lopez, who seems to have not really had any idea what was going on. Now, he didn't flee the scene. He stayed there and got the crap beat out of him by another person in the store. This was a case where I've been through this guy's entire clemency file. This is all of the files from when somebody tried to get them a pardon. This is down in Springfield, just dozens and dozens of pages. Kind of a cool thing in it, they included an entire diagram of the bakery / grocery store, where everybody would have been standing. So that briefly. And just to show how big this thing was, here is Aiden and his friend Benito holding it up. They were my research assistants that day. Strong evidence existed that Antonio Lopez did not have a gun, didn't know what was going on when he went in, certainly wouldn't have been involved in the planning. It came to be known as the Chanticleer of Murderers Row. While he was in jail, he entertained people with impressions of a rooster all the time. When they brought him to the death cell, he stood outside of the door for a second and gave the loudest rooster call yet, and the other prisoners cheered, and he told everybody, "I'm going to do that on the gallows tomorrow." Nobody's ever done that before. But he was given a reprieve. He got a couple of reprieves before eventually being hanged. When he actually was brought out to be hanged, he just requested to be shot instead. He didn't do the rooster impression then. But he was initially sentenced to be hanged at the same time as Sam Cardinella. And he's really just a case where they're kind of being inconsistent. But in 1936, the county physician remembered him from 15 years earlier as a human spider who wove a far-flung web of assassination and lurked in the shadows, while younger men, some hardly more than boys, carried out his fatal instructions. Here in this building in what is now Chinatown, he was operating a pool hall in 1919, and the story was that he would lure boys into the pool hall, then teach them to commit crimes and send them out to kill people and rob people. It's almost like he had read Oliver Twist and thought it was a how-to manual. So when they were eventually arrested in a daring raid, they admitted to killing at least 4 people and robbing 250. This was a couple of pictures of the gang, as they came to know them, the Sam Cardinella gang. The police initially started telling all of these stories. This was the guy. He was the mastermind. He taught them to commit all of these crimes. But there are a number of affidavits in his pardon file, which is absolutely enormous, saying that these kids have been telling other prisoners, "Can you believe it? They want me to pin it on that guy? That old fruit peddler? I think he barely spoke English, and they want me to say that he told our gang what to do?" The most they could really get was that he was holding the kids' guns for them. He might have been involved a little bit in the planning, but the whole idea that he was the criminal mastermind really falls apart under closer examination. I wouldn't say necessarily that he was innocent. He definitely was a little bit better connected than he made himself out to be. Probably spoke English better than he made out to the crowd, to the court as well. And also at the end of the pardon file, there's this big maudlin speech about how I came to America and saw the glorious Statue of Liberty and thought, "Here I will have liberty." It's just a little over the top. Not to mention, after they hanged him, they found a team of doctors and nurses trying to bring him back to life. Clearly the guy was a bit more connected than they said, but really, it's fairly clear that he was convicted mainly because he was the pool hall owner and they wanted to make an example out of him. It's a case where they definitely weren't being entirely consistent. You wouldn't think it would make sense to be making an example out of a pool hall owner, but this was late 1919. July of that year, all the saloons had been closed as kind of a warm-up for Prohibition. But police within days were saying, nope, this isn't doing a bit of good. All of the crime has just moved to the pool halls. Now, wanting to pin a big conviction like this on a pool hall owner would have been a major coup at the time, and that's really probably what they were planning. Really, by all available evidence, these guys, especially Nick the choir singer Viana up at the top right, had been killing people since way before the pool hall even opened. Vienna especially. But all right. 5 years after this, they switched to the electric chair, and at that point, my jurisdiction is closed. So I'm going to go ahead and move into the question and answer period. But first, a quick plug. This is the last Wednesday tour for a while. We're back on regular nights, but the time's still going to be a bit off. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, Mandy Crypt will be giving a talk on the Levy District and the history of sex work in Chicago. And then a week from then, next Thursday night, we'll be operating at 7 o'clock over on the Chicago for Chicagoans page. So there'll still be stuff for you guys. Just be on a different page. My tour next week will be about lost vice districts in Chicago. We'll be talking about places like the Black Hole, Rotten Row, and the Sands. We used to have quite a lot more of those. Once again, we got the Mysterious Chicago Dinners coming up as well. So just keep an eye out for those. I'll let you know when we have more information about those. It's going to be a really cool series. So everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago. And at that point, we will just lighten the mood up considerably here, I suppose, by putting on some Benny Goodman once again. Thanks, everybody. Here's Benny. So thanks, everybody. So this is 2 weeks in a row of brand new presentations. I don't know why I do these things to myself. I'm going to tell you, I had some good Johann Hawk stuff come into the legal archives today, including a major new bit of information. It might not seem major to the outside. It's not like a whole new murder or anything, but there's some dots to connect that I couldn't have connected before. My comments might have frozen. I haven't had one in a while here. So, which I think means I'm going to swing over to the Facebook page and get the comments on that. Might mess with the audio just a second here. It's loading, it's loading, it's loading. Now, there we go. Yeah, lots of information to absorb. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, that's a lot, quite a bit back there. There we go. Killed the audio there. Okay. Yes, Jackie, connect the dots. La 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 la. Yeah, my comments seem to have stopped over in that window a while ago.
Imagine apologizing for that.
I'm going back and catching it. I thought about doing Mayor Ogden talk. That might be interesting. Thanks, Katie. And thanks, John. Yeah, Joanne, we know that, but I'm a historian. I'll stick with the historical stuff. Thanks, Marita. I just got a message. The Chicago Tour Guide Professionals Association is thirsty for new members. Do I have to go to a meeting? Meetings. Okay, this is true. I'll be seeing Lindsay in a couple of weeks, I think. Kristen, I get it. I was the same way. I get nostalgic about my stuff. Why do you think I still got all my Star Wars guys? Thanks, Ashley.
I can't give you anything but love, baby. That's the only thing I'm plenty of, baby. Dream a while, scheme a while. You're sure to find.
Thanks to everybody who's still joining the Patreon
I guess
or hitting me up on one of these Venmo or PayPal.
I'd like to see you looking swell, baby.
Now, Bob, I don't know if the ones in Chicago were ever public picnics. They tended to happen on days that were too muddy for a picnic. It only happened a few times here.
Lucky day, you know darn well, baby. I can't give you anything but love.
No, Nancy, I do not get money from stars on Facebook. I'm supposed to, but there's something with my tax forms that was wrong and they won't let me fix it. And until I fix it, they won't send me the money that is accumulated. It's just kind of sitting there right now. My attempts to get it fixed have been frustrating and led to nothing. At least I'm not trying to make my money on Twitter. Right about now, that would be a mess. They'd probably pay me in like company script to be a Twitter Blue subscriber or something. Come doomsday girls and boys of dusk and blow your horns for Mr. Musk. Bob, my voice is coming in and out. Maybe that's just because I'm talking sometimes and not others. Nah, that's probably not it. But yeah, I will be seeing Eli next month. I'm sure we'll live stream something. We did not have a Stretch Armstrong, Timothy. I did have a lot of action figures. I do have a lot of action figures. Good night, Octavio. Well, the way things are going, you can about pay me in Tesla stock. Just don't wheel some off with the toilet paper roll. You hear my voice with the lips are not moving? I keep forgetting this Sunday's the Super Bowl. The Superb Owl. I still have many action figures just like sitting on my desk. Like I got Manny Faces right here. I keep him in monster form, but he can also be a robot or a guy. Why would anybody not keep him on the monster? In the same line, Ram Man. And he's missing his legs, but I got Cobra Khan too, who would squirt water in his heyday.
Helen Ward and Benny Goodman, and you hit the
Several Star Wars guys, up to and including Walrus Man. Pulled the bob on my butt. His name is Walrus Man. And a Gonzo from the Muppet Babies Happy Meal collection. There's a Kermit right here, popping up. Night night, Phoenix.
Like a balmy breeze on the night in May, you hit the spot
Once again, though they're not paying me to say this, I am drinking Black into the only whiskey aged by blasting Metallica into the casks. Taste the thing that should not be.
you got so much on the bottle, you hit the spot. Like a first embrace when the knot is tied, you hit the spot. Like a pipe and slippers by a fireside. Matter of fact,
Major
you
Rain.
don't know exactly what it is that you got, but you
Thanks, Kathy.
spot.
All right, everybody, I'll be logging off in a second as well. This is kind of one of my darker ones. We probably won't be redoing this one too often. It's a good one to have. It's a good one to have saved. There's a lot of news stories. But anytime I start talking about too much about hangings, it's just kind of depressing. Good night, Mom. Night, Avi.
Now Benny Goodman ends his half hour with a blaze of notes which we shall know as Digga Digga Doobie. You all remember this? Now listen to it played in the Goodman manner.
Elaine, let me know what you find out. Good night, Lisa. I'll let Benny finish up this tune. Yeah, about 2 more minutes. Monty Burns, you are the devil himself. Now, there's a difference between cheating on your taxes and playing the game. They give you all these riddles. Thanks, Cindy. Once again, this is the last of the Wednesday tours. Next week we're back on the Thursday schedule. The first week it'll be a little bit different time. We normally run at 8 o'clock. Next week it'll be 7. Also tomorrow at 7, tune in for Mandy Cripps Talk over on Chicago for Chicagoans. You can find their Facebook page at facebook.com/Chicago for Chicagoans. Mandy's talking tomorrow. I'm next week. So that'll be our Thursday presentation. So all right, thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, telling all of you to stay safe and stay strong, and of course, if you can, ladies and gentlemen, you gotta stay spooky. Have a great day, everybody.